You know what? I think it was just really good to have that injection of girl power towards the end of day 3. I think they injected something quite different into the dynamic environment here. Such a great deep dive into Christine's journey there, and expertly moderated by Esprit, who will be seeing a lot more of her as well as we continue. Now, we have a very special presentation, ladies and gentlemen, so please do ensure you come a bit closer if you want to, in order to make sure that we have a lovely intimate environment for this special presentation. All the way from LA, we have a representative of the largest talent company, talent agent in the world. This is very exciting, a division of CAA. We're going to be doing a deep dive into VC in Conversation, the next 730 days in consumer technology, the economy, and work. This is the intersection by looking at, we've tried a few different things this today here on day 3. We've looked at luxury brands, we've looked at sports world, and we've tried to give you a different, maybe a curveball look at the way technology interacts. Now, this is looking at a very different business model. And to take us through this is Leonard Brody, who's VC and co-founder and executive chairman of Caravan Group, based in LA. As I said, the largest talent agent in the world. Hollywood comes to mind, but we're going beyond the celebrities. We're actually going to share a few more behind-the-scenes tips. Now, this is going to be something where I just hand over to Leonard to shake things up, change the format a little bit. He's promised to keep you on your toes. So, ladies and gentlemen, please do welcome Leonard Brody on stage. Thank you. Over to you, Leonard.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm going to stick this here. All right, little intimate audience. So I have about 30 minutes with you, and I'm going to try, well, it looks like it's 20 now. I'm going to try to go through this really quickly. I was thinking on the way here about my career, which has been building tech startups and consumer companies for the last probably 20 years. Some of the stuff that I wish I would have known when I was beginning, and some of the things that I was thinking about. And the one thing that was always true for me, you can't predict the future. And so a lot of people will bill me out when I talk as a futurist. I'm not a futurist. I don't even know how I'm getting home from here, to be honest. But at the end of the day, you probably have a window of about 2 years, about 730 days to really understand what you can navigate in this type of economy. And so I've spent the last probably 10 years of my life not only building companies with celebrities, which is kind of boring, but the more interesting stuff that I do is very focused on driving an understanding of research around this pattern that we've been living in, all these huge big bang moments that you feel that kind of object and change your life, to see if there's any pattern to those. And so if you've been alive in the last 3 years, you'll know that there's been these massive life-changing events, these big bang moments have consistently happened, like when Dr. Ghebreyesus first tells us that we're in a pandemic during COVID, and when you have the second largest meltdown in American banking history with Silicon Valley Bank. And the list goes on, and these things seem to be happening much more regularly than they were before. And so the question is, are these things unique? Are these huge life-changing moments that we're experiencing faster, and is there a pattern to them? And in fact, what we found, and this is the thing as you're building companies I would encourage you to think a lot about, the worst thing about being a founder is you're so heads down in building your business that you almost never have the opportunity to actually look at the patterning around you. I can tell you, having worked with executives of almost every company and every size, this is the biggest weakness. The biggest weakness is not understanding the pattern of how things appear and reappear. Somebody mentioned earlier about everyone is adding .ai to their name, exactly like they did in the late 90s when they all added .com to their name. Most of these things are hugely cyclical, and the best way to think of them is they are these massive cycles that reset the operating system of the way we live. So when they happen, it's the equivalent of somebody putting your finger on the reset button and completely changing and altering the way we behave. And they're happening much quicker and much more frequently. Now, what I'll try to do in a short period of time is walk you through those cycles just so you understand them historically. Probably the most important thing I'll talk to you about this morning. Secondarily, I do want to talk a little bit about the economy, because I think if you're building a company, my training is actually in economics, and so I want to actually answer a core question for you, which is around the fundraising environment, and particularly the question about are we entering into recession or not. And lastly, I want to talk a little bit about consumers, which is the area that I spend most of my time in the fundraising environment, why it's a great time to be doing that. So let's go back and look at this pattern for a second. Again, the most important thing I'm going to talk to you about today is understanding this pattern. So if you get it right, you understand that most of the things that people talk to you about that they think is new, there's very little new going on in the world. And in order to get the sense of that, you got to go backwards. So if you looked at all of the things that we would value as a society, as human beings, if you looked at infant mortality and reduction, life expectancy increases, GDP increase, access to democratic institutions, if you go back 5,000 years in recorded history, the world looks exactly the same. You could have been born in 1128, reborn in 1455, you wouldn't have noticed a thing different in the world. It's not until you hit the British Industrial Revolution, which we call the First Reset, that in fact a pattern begins to emerge. And this moment is significant because, and you should understand this as technology founders, it is the first moment where human beings and technology interlace at scale. It is the moment where we begin a 300-year relationship with technology that put us in a pattern which is exactly the same pattern that you're repeating now. And so generally when you look at these big resets, historically there are 4 causes of them. 1 is financial crisis, 2 is typically war, the 3rd is technological shift, and the 4th is medical, which we went through with COVID. So over the last 300 years, this pattern that we're going through is caused by only these 4 things. Now, if we had this conversation in a decade, climate change will be on this list. It just hasn't happened in the sense of the scale that we're looking at it through this lens, but it'll most certainly be on this list in 10 years. So the thing to understand about these patterns, they are incredibly definable, they are repetitive, and they are very predictable. So when you look at these patterns, the problem that we have as human beings is we tend to think that everything occurs to us is original and unique, when in fact it isn't. And media makes that really difficult. You are all victims, we are all victims of mass media shifts that cause deep changes in the way we think about the world around us. Let me give you a pre-COVID example, which is causation of death. So what you're looking at here is the actual, on the left, the actual cause of death in North Americans. Your 2 biggest causes, I'm sure it's similar here, heart disease and cancer. But if you look at very quickly Google searches, you will see that very little searching about heart disease, quite a bit of cancer, but out of nowhere, terrorism becomes a searchable term for causation of death. Why? Because in the United States and Europe, your 2 biggest coverage in the media of causation of death is terrorism, even though it is statistically insignificant as a cause of death. So what you're experiencing is media myopathy, and you will see this in almost every aspect of what you do as building companies. So when you're thinking about consumers and you're thinking about building your companies, it's super critical to understand this pattern and recognize how deeply impacted media is on what you do. Now, when these things happen, when these massive resets occur, there are always 2 stages after. 1 is some form of economic devaluation. So that economics would look like a depression, a recession, inflation. Generally speaking, over the last 300 years, that hasn't lasted longer than 18 months. So we know that factually, and generally speaking, it can now be worked out as these reset moments are going rather than at the end, which I'll talk about in a second. And secondarily, it always ends in growth. And this is super important to understand. You have 0 historical precedent where one of these, not one, where one of these massive reset moments did not end in economic growth. And so the question that you always have to ask yourself when a COVID moment occurs, or an SVB, or the breakout of regional conflict, anything that's a huge event that you're worried about in an economic cycle or creates its own economic cycle will always end in growth. And that's the question you should ask, is how would you behave if you knew that growth was inevitable? Because too many people get stuck in the turtling around economic devaluation when there's no real need to do it. I mean, you have to do it from a managing your business perspective for a short period of time, but generally these are where the growth opportunities exist. And by the way, just to show you, if you look at the last big reset we went through prior to COVID, which was the Great Recession in 2007, the quarter by quarter mapping is exactly the same. You could have predicted the cycling of COVID almost to the quarter based on what we've seen in this cycle in past. It was super predictable. So let me shift gears to talk to you a little bit about the economy for a second. So the one thing I want to just be clear, you could put 50 economists on the stage here and ask them, are we going into a recession? And you'll get about 35 different answers, and one of them will be right. So at the end of the day, it goes back to what I was saying about media myopathy. You have to be really careful about understanding what's being told to you, because we're at risk of actually talking ourselves into a global recession. So when you think about recessions, and as a founder, it's really important that you understand these economic cycles because it affects fundraising, customers. I will tell you that the one thing in the United States anyway that is the biggest culprit, it's very complex about how a recession would work, but the biggest driver is something called quantitative easing. And all that means is over the last probably 13 years, the US government and other governments have been taking a foundational economic approach where they will buy their own bonds, in effect. And by doing that, they drive interest rates down and flood the market with money. And it works, by the way. In moments like COVID or the Great Recession, it was an incredible way to even out what could have been a horrific economic incident. So it works putting money in. We just don't have enough historical experience taking that money back out. And what you're experiencing now is the government's trying to figure out how to take trillions of dollars that were sitting in the system and pull them out in a way that doesn't crash the economy. And when you think about recession, it's very complex. There's lots of pieces to it. But if you're trying to ask yourself, is North America headed for recession or Europe or the Middle East? There's really two numbers you need to look at. And I'll just give you the US stats. So the first is unemployment, which is at historical record lows for the last 2 quarters. So check, that looks fine. And then if you look at GDP growth, the US is expected at the end of Q2 to hit 5.1%. So if these are the main drivers of what causes you to hit a recession, it doesn't look very likely in the math. And interest rates are being exceptionally well managed. There's a bit of a tick up when they cut the plan to reduce and continue to pull interest rates higher. We saw a bit of a rise in inflation, but it's relatively well managed. And you can see historically, like I wanted to give you guys some perspective on this around recessions. What you're looking at here is all of the months that we spent in recession since the late 19th century. What you'll see here is the long depression that happened in roughly around the 1870s, 1880s. It was 65 consecutive months of recession. Then came the Great Depression, where you had Roosevelt's New Deal. That was 43 months of recession. And it was there that we started to use economic instruments to be able to manage the economy, which we then did under COVID with something that we mentioned earlier called quantitative easing. So the thing to take about this is, even if you're going to go into recession and you're trying to manage cash flows and you're trying to manage your fundraising cycles, no one alive on this planet today has experienced a recession longer than 16 months. It hasn't happened. So even if it's going to happen, it's likely not going to be longer than that. But the math doesn't show us that it's heading in that direction. And if you ask people whether or not, this is recent data about whether or not we're getting into recession, you'll see, surprise, surprise, economists are split basically in half. But now most economists are moving to the view that we are not entering recession. But the important one is the United States Fed, of which 0% of the people working in the US government at the Fed think we're entering to recession. So are we going to hit a global economic recession? it is very unlikely. And the math is showing that clearly. What you're probably going to see is a bit of an economic slowdown. So instead of somebody slamming the brakes on a car, they're going to slowly pull the handbrake a little bit to try to pull some of that money that flooded into the economy out. And that's the pain you're experiencing with these rise in interest rates. So as you're thinking about customers and you're thinking about fundraising, keep that number of 16 months in the back of your mind if it happens at all. So let me end off in the few minutes that I have with you just to talk a little bit about consumers and consumption and fundraising. I think one of the biggest lessons that we've learned over the last sort of 5 years is that human beings, forget about what generation you're part of, whether you're Gen X or a millennial, you are fundamentally different. If you were born 2007 and after the iPhone came out, you were fundamentally a different person sociologically and even physiologically than the people who walked here 30 years ago. You are no longer the same human being. And the reason is because you are fundamentally two people. You're a physical identity, the people that you are sitting in this room, and you are a digital identity, the person that you are when you're interacting with other people behind a screen. And by the way, your values and your norms and your trust and how you relate to people, totally different behind a screen compared to how you do it physically. For example, your trust in the physical world is way less, surprisingly, than your trust in the digital world. You'll give 5 times as much data about yourself digitally than you would ever do physically. That may change over time, but that's the way it is now. And if you look, we are awake for 16 hours in the United States, generally. 13 of those 16 hours, I'm sure the math is exactly the same here, 13 of those 16 hours are spent in front of a screen. So the vast majority of your waking hour is in front of a screen, not in front of physical people. And if you ask the average American under the age of 30, the majority of them would refer to themselves as online beings first, as a digital identity first, not a physical identity. This has dramatic impact for how you think about marketing, how you think about people buying. It's a completely different shift, which most corporations and most governments don't quite understand. Now, one of the things I would say is most venture is pulling people away from the consumer markets. I would encourage you to think differently. All roads lead to consumption and all roads lead to consumers. Now is an incredible time to be investing in the consumer economy. They use the company through which they're buying. And I'm not saying you have to be a virtue signaler and it has to be about sustainability or positive values. But when you're buying, we went from kind of infinite, restricted media to infinite media, and we went from restricted product to now infinite product. And the one thing that cuts through when people are buying anything from software to physical goods is the values of the business they're buying from. So the clearer you are about that, the better you cut through the noise and the better your returns are. And one thing I did want to mention about blockchain, I think when you look at the history of how human beings consume stuff, it started in markets, it moved to Main Street, it moved to big boxes, then it moved to loyalty and loyalty programs, and then it moved to direct-to-consumer. The question is, what's the next evolution in a market where you can buy anything, anywhere, at any time? And I think blockchain is going to have a very significant impact on how people buy. I think it will be the evolution of how customers connect to brands. So most companies will begin their lives as tokens. They will begin selling products that have affiliated tokens beside them. Not all companies, but many smart ones will. And if you want to watch the luxury goods space a little bit to see how they're doing it now, it's a very good window into how consumers will behave in about 3 to 5 years. Now, I want to end off just on this note, and after the historical patterning, this is the second most important thing that I can say to you. You are living in an era of mass-scale fraud and false prophecy. The rise of consistent and persistent social media accounts has led to an era where you are being misled at scale, where there are 50,000 life coaches and 6,000 CEO coaches and a bunch of doctors who are not licensed to be practicing, giving you information. There's a very famous doctor in the United States, who I won't mention his name, who's a cardiologist who is completely unlicensed to give neurological advice, but is doing so on the internet every day. I would be super careful over the next 5 years of your life of being very clear where your information comes from, because what will happen, SBF is really just the beginning. You will see a large-scale shift in the way that people consume data, because the scale at which people are false prophesizing is pretty much unforeseen historically. So just be careful, including what I'm telling you. You know, you should value check and frankly check everything that you're seeing. But at the end of the day, you will be, certainly people born 2007 and after, will be part of the largest snake oil salesman grift in human history. And so if you're careful about that, and you can focus your energies a little bit on understanding these historical patterns, and I would really make an effort to try to be a student of it and spend time, because you'll be a much better founder, you'll be a much more successful entrepreneur, and frankly, parent or human being alive. And I think if you can master understanding these cycles, you'll learn very quickly that everything new is really old. And let me give you one example. Look at how quickly people abandoned cryptocurrency. Look at how quickly people walked away as if it was suddenly all these people that were trading in crypto and making a fortune. As soon as the winter happened, they were gone. It was a failure. It was a fraud. Crypto didn't work. That would be the equivalent of saying that no one was going to buy pet food on the internet after the fall of Petco in 1999. It's short-sighted, and it's on the wrong side of history. One thing just to leave you on that thought, because it goes to both being misled and understanding these cycles. When you think about large-scale technological advances, go back to this whole point of these huge reset moments, whether it was the internet, mobile, whether it's Web3, blockchain, AI, it's irrelevant. And by the way, AI, there's nothing new about AI. AI has been around since 1936. So when all of these things cycle through, you should always be looking for the through pattern and how they started and how they got to where they were. And when you think about things like crypto winters and pets.com and all these big disasters, remember that how we advance as an innovation society is by new technology being flooded with massive amounts of irresponsible money. Everyone looks at it and they're like, oh, you know, all these idiots put money into crypto and all these idiots gave money to SBF, minus the fact that he was a criminal. But the point of it is you do not advance at the scale that we are advancing without huge amounts of irresponsible money being put into unproven technology and business models. Without that, you don't advance. And so all of the venture community who shits on everyone and is like, oh, valuations are too high, and like they didn't have any responsibility in doing that, just remember to look at the historical patterning, and I can definitely tell you this is going to be one hell of a 730 days ahead of you. Appreciate you guys having me. Thank you.